hair phone, makeup on?
You're on.
Okay, there. Yeah. Everybody understand we're in the 504 workshop, and we're talking about Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. And if you saw the presentation that was in the cafeteria, you begin to realize this is the first piece of legislation that dealt with education for children with disabilities. The first national piece of legislation. So, and what it says under Section 504 is that you're not going to discriminate against me on the basis of age, race, gender, nature of origin, or disability. And it says that children who qualify under Section 504 are entitled to a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. You're also entitled to non-discrimination, and you're entitled to appropriate evaluation under Section 504. It's a broader base, and you can just kind of flip through these as we get going here. This is Family Network on Disabilities, who we are, what we do, what we don't do. One more. And here we have the three lined together, which are the protections of federal law that children with disabilities in the public education system have. We have IDEIA, which is the Individuals with Disability Education Improvement Act, which is the last 2004 regulations as IDEA was reauthorized. That's the IEP, okay? Then we have Section 504 of the Rehab Act, and then we have the Americans with Disabilities Act. If you qualify for an IEP under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, you automatically have the protections of Section 504. You automatically have the protections of the ADA. So all those come together if you qualify for an IEP. All are federal mandates. All of them are federally enforced. They're not an option. You have to do these for children with disabilities. Okay, flip next. And please keep in mind you can take these at home. So you really don't have to absorb everything at once, but you can go online and take these, or you can take them on the training discs that are in your bag at home in English, Spanish, and Creole. So here's the definition of Section 504. You have to be a recipient of federal fundings for 504 to apply. The ADA is your public entity. So under Section 504, for it to apply, you have to be a recipient of state or federal funds. So law says federal funds. The reason I add state funds in there is because states receive federal funding. Therefore, if they're giving state funding out, then that person that's receiving the state funding should also be in compliance with Section 504 because states have to be. So you have to be that recipient of federal funding under 504, and public schools receive federal money. So what we're going to talk about today is Section 504 and how it applies to children with disabilities that are in the public school system. And then you have to determine when you're looking at which one of these laws apply. But since we're talking about 504 specifically today, we're looking at equal access. So when you talk about Section 504, the simplest way to look at it is to say, here is a child that has a disability, here's a child that doesn't have a disability, and compare the two. So whatever this child that does not have a disability can do, this child that does have a disability has a right to do the same things and all the support that is required to give them equal access to an education as adequately as a non-disabled peer. And you can read this, it's in the law. So it's as adequately. And when you look at IDEA, you have to get an IEP, you have to need specially designed instruction. Meaning you have to need a special education teacher to qualify under IDEA and to get an IEP. And you have to fall under that state category to be eligible under IDEA. Under Section 504, this is what you need to be able to qualify. You have to have a record or a history of a disability, and it has to impede with a major life activity. Seeing, hearing, breathing, walking, talking, learning. So if my disability impedes with one of those, including learning, then I'm going to look at the protections of Section 504, which I may not qualify for an IEP, but I would qualify for protections under Section 504. And when you look at the definition of what a free, appropriate public education means under Section 504, and a lot of people think it just means preferential seating in the front of the class. But it states that it can be general education, special education, and related services that are not exhaustive. To get them under IDEA with the IEP, I have to have a goal. The goals are your specially designed instruction. So you get all these related services and support for the goals. Under Section 504, I need it because I need to access an education as adequately as a non-disabled peer. So it's broader based, it's civil rights. IDEA is very procedural. It tells you step by step by step what it is you must do to write that IEP. And it's also funded. They get money for it. Section 504 is unfunded, and it just simply states you have to document that you're doing these things. You have to say appropriate evaluation, but it doesn't really come down and state exactly what that means. So if my child doesn't qualify for a service under IDEA, because they don't meet that criteria, like speech and language, then I'm going to look at it as a related service under Section 504. So I may be continued to get that service under Section 504 that I would not qualify under IDEA. So that's where Section 504 comes on. And when you look at IDEA, it's really targeting the instruction in the class, but then Section 504 and the ADA expand that. That's why we have access and ramps and all the things, handicap parking spaces and all those things, is because it's equal access. It's got to be equal. So you've got to give it equal access, and you can't discriminate. And it also under Section 504 is you can't discriminate on the basis of race or age or gender, nature of origin, or disability. So you have all of those things tied together under Section 504. But what applies to kids the most is the disability, as far as we're concerned, is looking at that equal access. We just talked about this. You got to need the special education to get an IEP. Deanna? Just kind of flipping through these to catch up. All right, there we have, if you take a look at the kids where I said earlier that under the IEP, that's the small umbrella, those kids have the protection. But then you look, they have the protection, then we go up as don't qualify for the IEP under 504 and the ADA. So 504 and the ADA may cover some kids that don't qualify under IDEA, but as you can see, those protections cover those kids under IDEA. And then the other kids that would be out there where it's raining, that's no child left behind now. That was a joke, folks. Let's go on.
We're moving ahead. We're not stopping to laugh. We're not stopping to laugh. We're moving ahead with the slides.
Oh, okay. She said that. Did you get that on copy? So we're going to move on. Provisions of 504, that free appropriate public education or FAPE, to be appropriately identified, meaning you've got to seek out and find those kids. It's called child find. You have the same thing under IDEA, but we have to seek out and evaluate and make sure that those children that have disabilities, that's under identification, and that we're going to use appropriate evaluation when we make that determination, and that there will be a document that you're going to document that you're doing it. And in this case, we consider it to be a written education plan, but it states with under Section 504 that you have to document that you're doing it. So that may be the plan. If your child qualifies under with an IEP, generally the provisions of 504 can be added into the IEP under the accommodations that you need, and so they consider that to be a 504 plan also. But it has to be a document in writing to show me you're meeting of a child's needs under Section 504. And then supplemental aids and services, and how that's referred to in Section 504 is because those children are served in a regular education environment. So they're in the least restrictive environment in a regular ed classroom, and they're getting the supplemental aids, what they need, which are non-exhaustive, to give them equal access to an education as adequately as a non-disabled peer. Least restrictive environment, maximum extent appropriate, child will be taught in the regular education environment with those supplemental aids and services. And then you have a set of procedural safeguards, just like you would have under IDEA, but there are two separate laws and two separate procedural safeguards, though they do parallel each other very closely.
How do they differ?
Huh?
How do the ADA and the 504 differ?
Well, the ADA 504 only applies to entities or recipients of federal funding. And what we're talking about under Section 504 is specifically non-discrimination on the basis of the things we discussed: race, gender, age, nature of origin, and disability. The ADA, if you're a public entity, then you have to make the reasonable accommodation, and the ADA only applies to disability. Where Section 504 is broader, it covers those other areas of discrimination. The Americans with Disabilities Act is just access, and it's only for disability. And it's enforced through the same Office for Civil Rights. So when you're looking at the enforcement of Section 504, our regional office is in Atlanta, Georgia. So if you'd have questions on the first level about Section 504, as far as a definitive, that would come out of Atlanta. What?
Just so I could better understand, I use an example. Section 504 would be for all public places has to have handicap ramps and
well, that adds to that, but the ADA also covers that.
But the ADA would be something related to public school, public building?
Public school, public building, anything out there that's access to the public. Section 504, you have to be a recipient of federal funding.
Okay.
So therefore, the ADA doesn't require that, 504 does.
Okay.
So under 504, you'd have to receive that funding, and public school systems do receive funding under Section 504. Okay?
Glad you said that.
Okay.
Yeah.
And where IDEA says that we have to get these services to be able to progress in the general curriculum and to benefit from the specially designed instruction of the goals on your IEP, when you look at 504, it's just give me access as adequately as a non-disabled peer. So whatever a child without a disability is doing, a child with a disability has the same rights and all the supports and services that it needs to be able to give me equal access. And that's just what I said. So let's go to the next one. And this is the definition of the evaluation. And these, when we look at that IDEA, and when you're looking at an IEP, you have to use more than one evaluation, and they're a lot more detailed and instructive than what they would be under Section 504. But we have to use what is appropriate evaluation to determine how having a disability impacts this child's ability to access that education as adequately as a non-disabled peer. Those can be periodic, but they're really not defined. Before any significant change in placement, you would have to do the reevaluation. But flip on. Section 504 doesn't really require that reevaluation piece, and it's not as procedural as IDEA. IDEA, you know, you got to do the total reevaluation at least 3 years upon request when we look at these things. But 504 is just kind of back one. And you see, this isn't as detailed as what IDEA is when we look at Section 504. Person's knowledgeable about the child. So you can see some of these things are a little bit broad and open to interpretation, but that interpretation has to come from the Office for Civil Rights. And here's the placement steps, looking at the IEP, 504, and the ADA. Now here we look at a full line of continuum of placement. So what we look at in the first place, least restrictive environment, would be which one of those on the screen? Anybody? Which one of those is least restrictive?
Top one?
Absolutely. So we look at regular class, fully included, with those supplementary aids and services, and that's what we look at under Section 504. And then only when we determine that a child is not benefiting from being in that setting, even though we're providing the supplemental aids and services, then we begin to look moving outward on a line of continuum placement. And the next step may be pull out, maybe just going out for one class for services, then back into the regular education environment. And then we look at, if we're not meeting the needs in that, we might go to full-time ESE classroom. And then we go out to the alternative schools, or what they call a special school. So you might have a special school for behavior. You might have a special school for whatever disability they're looking at, or whatever category that they need meet. So that's a special school. And then we look at hospital homebound for kids that are being served at home or actually in a hospital setting, that they're still continue to have the right to an education, and that services need to be continue to be provided. And then the last on the line of continuum is full-time residential therapeutic. So the kids are actually living there and they're getting that instruction 24/7. Wherever you're at in that line of continuum, you're working on whatever it is that kept you out of that first one. So we're always looking, as we move outward on a line of continuum, to meet the need and address it to where that child can move backward into the least restrictive environment. So we're always trying to work on that skill and move those kids back in their regular education environment, or the least restrictive environment.
Can I ask you a question? Does that include honors and gifted programs?
Now, the gifted program is the Javits Gifted Amendment. And unless the child has the IEP, if you're looking at a child with a disability that has an IEP and can be gifted. But the gifted program itself is under the Javits Gifted Amendment. And it's not IDEA, it's not under the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's a totally separate program. If I was to say that you were discriminating against me because I was gifted, simply because of that, then that is a class of individuals, then maybe I would have something to say under Section 504 as far as discrimination. But what we're talking about here is simply disability. So gifted is separate and it's different, a different law than what these are. It's not a disability and it's not under IDEA. It is administered to the Exceptional Student Education Department from Tallahassee, but it's not special ed. So gifted would be different, okay?
I have a child right now, he's at honors, and he has a specific learning disability.
So he has a disability.
And he's ADHD. And he wants to apply to a magnet program, but we're waiting to see if he gets accepted, what kind of accommodations they're going to give him, because that's what we're dealing with now, is that he scored high enough to be put into honors, but because he was struggling a little bit, they want to put him back down. which the year before, he wasn't put in honors because they was trying to see how he's gonna do. So it,
And we're talking, and what you're talking about, when you're talking about a charter school or magnet school,
well, not yet,
they're still public schools.
yes.
And if they're public schools, 504 applies. The child has a record of a history of disability, he has a learning disability, and there's a record of history of that. Therefore, he would be entitled under 504 to equal access.
Cause like now,
Either one.
this school year, they were supposed to, take him off for IEP because he was doing so well. But they switched the ESC specialist, so we still have an IEP. We got a new one this year. So my fear is what happens when they take him off of it.
Section 504 would apply.
I won't let him.
So, I mean, you still have a record of history of disability, and if it still impedes with his ability to learn, you know, the first thing you have to, before you're staffed out of IDEA and no longer eligible under IDEA, you have to show me that I no longer need the specially designed instruction. So if I don't need the special ed anymore, then and our ultimate goal is to get them out of special ed. You know, if they don't need it, that's like, even with early intervention and saying that we try to get those services in there, is to get the service to the children so they don't need to be going into special education. But you have to staff them ineligible, and at that point, then we start talking about 504. Because he may still need the protections of Section 504. He didn't cure his disability, and simply because he doesn't need the special ed doesn't mean he doesn't need the supports and services to benefit as adequately as a non-disabled peer, even if it's from the gifted program. So whatever he needs to benefit from that, if he qualifies for that criteria to be eligible for that, then he should get the accommodations necessary to give him equal access to that particular program. Okay?
I've got a question.
Did we lose Vanna?
My 13-year-old daughter is spelled deaf and blind.
Okay.
She recently took the first part of the Braille Challenge.
Okay.
And she told us that they forced her to put on a pair of headphones even though they knew that she was deaf. And that what that was part of the challenge was that you had to be able to listen and Braille accurately what you were hearing. And she said, no, I cannot do this. I'm deaf. I need my interpreter. And they told her she was not permitted to have the interpreter. And I said, wait a minute, you can't deny her that right. That is her right by law to have that interpreter. And they said, no, we are not covered under the ADA. We are a challenge. We are a contest. We are not protected under the ADA from that discrimination.
Well, and I go back saying the only person that I'm aware of or agency that interprets federal law is the federal government. So I would ask for that in writing, and then I would address it with the agency that's responsible for interpreting federal law. And in the first instance, that's the Office for Civil Rights out of Atlanta, Georgia. And so you can address any issues with the ADA or Section 504 directly with their office. But getting things in writing, and I'm really not sure the program which you're talking about as far as how they're structured. But I would,
written in emails, yes.
I would want those things in writing, and then I would ask that opinion of the Office for Civil Rights out of Atlanta.
Civil rights.
And they're the ones who interpret it. And it's Atlanta on the first level, but ultimately we're talking about Washington, D.C. And we'll get into that a little bit more when we're looking further into it. There's a few lists of supplemental aids and services, but all those things out there are non-exhaustive. So you have all these things, it's non-exhaustive. What does it take to give you equal access under Section 504? And that includes special education if you need it. So you may not qualify under IDEA for special education, and a perfect example of that is years back in the day, as my son would say, yeah, Dad, back in the day, uphill both ways in the snow, I know. Speech and language was only considered specially designed instruction in the state of Florida. To get it, you had to qualify for that. Well, it's considered a related service under Section 504. So parents in the state of Florida filed a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights saying it was a related service as well as specially designed instruction. They prevailed in the complaint, which actually made the state of Florida change the rules, state rules and regulations to reflect that speech and language is a related service, and you can get it under Section 504 as well. So whatever it needs to be, and you can't have two conflicting laws. You can't have IDEA saying one thing and then Section 504 coming over here and saying something different. So they have to parallel and they have to match and they can't conflict. And so that complaint in itself was enough to get speech and language back as a related service. So whenever I'm not eligible for something under IDEA through the IEP process, it may be because I don't need that specially designed instruction. I may not need the related services to support the goals on the IEP, but when I'm staffed out of there, I'm over here on Section 504, I'm looking at it to be able to access an education as adequately as a non-disabled peer, period. So we look how those two apply. And the ADA, which is a stronger law, very stronger law, and that is umbrella across the board for people with disabilities, and that's just solely a non-discriminatory law that gives me equal access. Okay, let's go on to, and these are the examples of the supplemental aids and services. Once again, those are not exhaustive. In the least restrictive environment, we're looking at regular education, but we still have that line of continuum placement. And it's only, we don't have to earn our way into the regular classroom. You know, the right to least restrictive environment is a right. It's not a privilege. It is a right. And it's only when you can show me that I cannot benefit from an education in the regular education environment satisfactorily that you begin to look at moving me outward on a line of continuum placement, always looking to move me back into the least restrictive environment of the regular education classroom. There's your procedural safeguards. You have the right to notice, records, and under Section 504 you have a right to an impartial hearing. And it's kind of different than a due process hearing under IDEA. And it's, your school district is supposed to maintain a impartial, knowledgeable hearing officer, and to have Section 504 processes in place for a hearing. Every school district is required to have a Section 504 procedural manual. So if you want to know how your school district is doing Section 504, it's in writing through that procedural manual. And they also have appointed in every school system a 504 compliance person. There's a person within the district who is over Section 504. In our county, that person is under psychological services. And then they have it individually within each and every building, a person that looks at Section 504 within each school. So I don't know what the process is in your school district, but you can simply call them up and ask to speak to the 504 compliance person, whoever that person is appointed, and that they're going to have that impartial hearing process, and you can ask for that 504 procedural manual, which should outline what that looks like. And then you have the review to the procedure. There's a definition of what related services are, and under Section 504, it is to give me access as adequately as a non-disabled peer. IDEA, it is to support goals and objectives. There's the two differences. More related services, because transportation is a related service. Medical, behavioral, all those are related services. The list of all the related services under IDEA also apply under Section 504. list, transportation, counseling, all these things that children without disabilities do. I have the same rights and the same access. We're just kind of using this as a backdrop as we go here. Parental participation, they can share. It's not, because Section 504 isn't procedural as idea, you're not really required. Consent's not required. Parent participation is really not required. It's something they should do. That's why they kind of call it a regular education law, because Section 504, though, applies across everything. Generally, we're talking about a regular education environment, and we're looking at those accommodations. It's not a lot different as far as, it's a little bit narrower under the response to intervention process that's in place currently, that we're using these scientifically based research, and we're getting help to children in a regular education environment prior to moving to special ed. Well, 504 would be the same way, only it is children with disabilities, but it's in that regular education environment. We're not really moving them outward yet. Conflict resolution, that's that 504 procedural manual. Under Section 504, if you feel that your rights are being violated, you can begin with that locally with the 504 hearing, try to work out resolution with your school system. And we always, when there's any conflict, you always try to begin at that lowest level. Start with a talk with a teacher, maybe the building principal. And if you can't reach resolution, then you begin to move upward on that line there and start looking at these other options there too for you. Under Section 504, you can talk to that compliance rep. You can reconvene your 504 team if you're eligible. Talk to the teacher and the principal. And then you have the right to file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights out of Atlanta, Georgia. You can do that online. They have a form online. You can go to their site. You can read it. You file that complaint with the Office for Civil Rights out of Atlanta. It's a 180-day time frame for them to complete the complaint. So it's a pretty long process. When you file your complaint, if you should do that, you ask for early complaint resolution. Because what OCR is looking for is compliance. They really want to come together, come up with a solution, and implement that. So you ask for early complaint resolution so that within 90 days of that initial, if you can come to an agreement and put it in writing, then OCR will close the complaint. That will be the resolution to your complaint. And so the time frame, it's cut in half. If any time beyond that, once the case is closed, OCR does not monitor the compliance of the complaint. That would be your job as a parent to make sure that they're doing that, and should they violate the agreement, then you simply file another complaint with OCR. If you file your initial complaint with the Office of Civil Rights and you get that ruling back from them out of Atlanta and you don't like it, you have the right then to appeal that decision, and none of this requires an attorney. You can appeal that decision to the Office of Civil Rights, U.S. Department of Education, Washington, D.C. So you have the right to appeal that decision on up into Washington and get that ruling there. It is the last piece of legislation that we have as parents to where you can appeal to a federal level without an attorney. Because under IDEA, now if you file a state complaint with them, and you look those on the right side there, and you disagree with the ruling that comes back, you would have to initiate a due process hearing and actually go to court and go through the court system. And it's very lengthy. And the one thing that I do have to say about conflict is that even if you go to court, and even if you go all the way to federal court, and you get a ruling, where do you end up? Where do you end up after the ruling, after the court, after it's all over? Right back where you started, right back in the school that you just took due process. So what my favorite saying about due process is even when you win, you lose. Everybody loses when you go to court. This law is 35 years old. Do you think there's much out there that hasn't been to court already? So there's tons and tons of case law out there that define, and it continues to, and we're going to continue to get those. But I am a real firm believer, my personal opinion, I don't believe in court. I don't think we should be there. I think you should work with your school. You should get along together. Go in there, get involved as parents, be part of your school advisory councils, and look at making things better. But you have the rights. If nothing else, this are your procedural safeguards under both laws there, IDEA and Section 504, to make sure that your child gets an education. And for children with disabilities, as you heard earlier today, until the 70s, we didn't have any rights. There were absolutely no rights at all. So until those laws were passed and they continue to be developed, then we have the protections under law for our children. And also a right under Section 504 is the right to transition. Because children without disabilities have a right to prepare to go to college, right? So we're teaching them. So children with disabilities also have that same right to that post-secondary or life preparation. So that's when we're looking under Section 504. So if I don't have an IEP, I'm in regular education, I still have the protections of Section 504 in saying that I have a right to transitional services. So those things are all out there. Missed my van out. And there is the address for the Office of Civil Rights. It's in your note sheets. If you'd like to write it down, the person from the Office of Civil Rights that we've had a lot of contact with, the gentleman's name is Roger Mills. He's very accessible, more than willing to talk to parents. Actually, he's come down and done a lot of trainings with us as a PTI, and he's taking about 94% of the calls that you would get if you called Atlanta to file a complaint. So I always suggest that you call them, and kind of talk to Roger or somebody from OCR prior to filing a complaint, and they'll be very honest with you and provide you a lot of information. But it is the right you have, and there's the agency that you would address under Section 504.
So,
Make sure you
Yes.
fill out your evaluations, okay?
does Section 504 cover colleges and universities?
Absolutely.
If my son wants to go to college at a university and the university, as with recent budget cutting, is no longer providing note takers, that child who is visually impaired, how does he get that service?
He would call the Office for Civil Rights, and he would address it with them. Because once you leave high school, once you exit with a standard diploma, or you age out at 22, IDEA no longer counts. You're no longer, because IDEA, it applies to a public school system and education within there. So once you get a standard diploma, once you get aged out at 22, that law no longer applies. The 504 and the ADA both follow children with disabilities into life. And that would apply to post-secondary settings such as colleges. It also applies to work. And that's one of the important things that you look at when you're teaching kids that are coming through schools. The last thing that we have to do, under IDEA, there's a thing called summary performance. And that's when we transition out. One of the things we should be teaching our children is how to become advocates for themselves. How to say, I have a disability when I'm being hired. Because if I don't state it when I'm being hired, if it's not obvious, then they don't make that accommodation for it. And under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have to make that reasonable accommodation for me to be able to hold the same job as this person that doesn't have a disability. But you have to state that. So we have to teach them about their disabilities, make them aware of that, and then follow that out into post-secondary.
I want to ask you about when you go to college and tested as an adult, where can you get tested as an adult?
As far as what test, the college entrance exam, or?
No, tested as an adult to have services.
it all depends if you're going through the Department of Vocational Rehab, depending on your disability, if you qualify for that going on to college or post-secondary, they'll do testing before you're eligible for their services. If not, most college campuses have some type of a disability accessibility office. So you can simply, when you're going in there for enrolling in college and taking the initial college entrance exams, the young adult, because you can't call them children anymore, they get upset when you do that, they should be able to go down to that accessibility office and they will guide them through whatever it is necessary for them to be able to get into the college setting.
We've been down. First I sent him down because he had started school, and then they sent him back saying that they couldn't do anything because he hasn't been assessed as an adult. So then, then I went in for them to explain that to me, and they told me that he needs to be assessed for an adult. They don't do it through the school system.
What is, and I really have a difficulty in understanding what assessment it is, and I would be asking that.
It's like when you have
He has a disability?
He has a specific learning disability.
What college did you go to?
Valencia.
Valencia? Wow. I've been there, and I also know people who have been there who have specific learning disabilities through their school life, and when they've gone to Valencia, they said, I have a specific learning disability. These are the accommodations that help me get through. And Valencia never said there was any testing involved. It's like, okay, we'll accommodate you, and you have to talk to the specific teacher.
What happened with him was that usually before you finish high school, they test you as an adult, but he wasn't tested as an adult. So that when he went to college, he was tested for an adult, but he didn't have an adult IEP or anything else.
I don't understand the adult IEP
I
process.
don't even understand.
So I would ask
That's
for,
what they told me.
I would ask for the policy in writing. Show me your policy, let me see it. Did he apply at the Department of Vocational Rehab for services?
He went there one time and he didn't go back.
Well, maybe doing the follow-up with DVR, because what they would have done is, the first thing they would have done was assess him to see if he's eligible for their services. So you would have had that assessment from DVR anyway, as far as moving forward. And so if you qualify under services with the Department of Vocational Rehab, which can take up to 6 months once you apply, but it was years ago, back in the day, as my son would say, but my son, being hearing impaired, deaf, qualified for services under DVR, Department of Vocational Rehab, when he applied. Based on your individualized plan for employment, then they looked at him and they asked him what he wanted to do. Well, at that instance, he wanted to be a school psychologist, a certified behavioral analyst. So, based on that, what's it take to be that? College education. So they paid for him to go to college. So they actually placed him and paid for him to be in college. But to continue to do that.
But that was a separate entity from the college. That was voc.
Correct. But I'm talking about the evaluation.
They have all their criteria for evaluating and qualifying because they're putting up funds for something.
But that's the evaluation piece that would have carried forth to the college, because you would have had that evaluation conducted, and you would be able to take that information into the college setting, and this is the most recent testing evaluations that have been done.
But it's not, as far as I know, it's not a requirement to have that.
Well, that's where I say ask for, that's why I say I would ask for the written policy.
That's what they told us, that they could give him any services, any kind of accommodations or anything without him being tested as an adult.
From now on, if you have those questions, who are you going to call?
I'm gonna call the
Office for Civil Rights out of Atlanta, Georgia. And you're going to ask them, because it's that definitive. They're the people in the federal government who enforce the law. They're the ones who interpret it. So you have those questions, you need to call them. And therefore you get that, you get the right answer.
And then they learn about the places that are giving you incorrect information.
Well, it's not only that, then they're supposed to enforce the law.
Yeah.
So if we're violating over here, then they need to address that policy. But they should have, as a college, they should have an ADA person. They should have that an accessibility person. And you just need to access that point. Please fill out your evaluations. Keep our 1-800 number. You can always reach them. You can reach me anytime. They have no qualms at all about transferring your calls right down to me. And anything I can do to help you, and if you don't get it all here today, just remember we're here. We're not going away. So we're here for you. We're free.